Elias Ward had always been a quiet man. He lived alone on a wide stretch of land between the Arizona and New Mexico borders, where the sun rose slowly and the mornings smelled of dust and dry sage. His ranch was simple: 2 small barns, a windmill, a few cattle, and a worn wooden house that creaked whenever the desert wind passed by. Elias liked that. After losing his family years ago to sickness, he found comfort in open land, clear skies, and honest work. That morning, before the sun had fully climbed over the mesas, he saddled his old bay horse, Ryder, and rode out to check the water lines near the far end of his land. The air was cool, the kind of coolness that lasted only a short time before the desert heat swallowed it whole. Elias enjoyed these early hours. Things were quiet, and he could think clearly, without distraction. As he rode, he noticed something strange in the distance. Thin trails of smoke, rising straight upward, not drifting like normal smoke. It looked too controlled, too deliberate. He slowed his horse and watched the sky. He had seen signal smoke before, when he crossed paths with the Apache people. But this smoke was different. It looked forced, like someone tried to copy a signal, but didn't know how to do it correctly. Elias frowned. He was not a man who ignored odd signs. Living alone taught him that strange things usually meant trouble on the frontier. He gave Ryder a gentle nudge and turned toward the smoke. The ride took him over uneven ground, past dry bushes and scattered rocks. The land grew quieter the farther he went. Even the birds seemed to avoid that area. Elias kept a hand near the small rifle hanging from his saddle, not because he expected danger, but because the desert had taught him to respect the unexpected. When he reached the ridge overlooking a small clearing, he stopped his horse and his breath at the same time. Below him, near a large old tree, lay 7 Apache girls. They were still and silent. On the ground, for one terrifying moment, Elias feared the worst. Then, looking closely, he saw the slight rise and fall of their chests. They were breathing. They were unconscious, but alive. Elias guided his horse quietly down the slope and dismounted. He moved carefully, speaking softly even though they could not hear him. "Easy now. I'm here to help." The girls were young. Some looked no older than 8 or 9, others in their early teens. Their wrists and ankles were tied with rough rope, the kind traders used. The ropes were loose enough to show they had struggled, but not enough to hurt them. Around them were signs that someone had tried to stage something: broken branches, marks on the ground, and pieces of cloth tied to the tree, as if someone wanted to make the place look like a tribal punishment site. But nothing about it felt right. Apache punishment traditions, from what Elias knew, were private, respectful, and never carried out on children. This scene felt artificial, almost staged for someone else to find. Elias checked each girl carefully, making sure they were breathing steadily. He used his water canteen to wet their lips. A couple of them stirred, whispering weakly in Apache words he recognized only partly. They were scared. Even in their half-conscious state, fear clung to them. "It's all right," Elias said gently. "You're safe now. I'm not here to harm you." But they were too weak to understand his tone fully. He knew they needed shelter, water, and rest, things they could not get out here on the open land. Elias looked around for signs of whoever did this. He found wagon tracks leading away from the clearing, heading east. They were fresh. Someone had left not long before he arrived. He also found pieces of fabric on the ground that didn't match Apache clothing. The pattern was wrong. The stitching was wrong. This was someone pretending to be Apache. He stood there for a moment, trying to understand why anyone would go through such trouble. Why would someone stage such a scene? Why would they use children to do it? The thought bothered him deeply. He couldn't leave the girls here. That was the first clear truth. The second truth was that whoever staged this might come back. And if they found him with the girls, well, he didn't want trouble, but he would not abandon innocent children to danger. Elias gently lifted the smallest girl first and placed her on his horse, supporting her with a rope looped safely so she wouldn't fall. Then he carried the others two at a time, making several trips between the ridge and the clearing. It took time, sweat, and strength, but Elias didn't complain. He only focused on moving them safely. The older girls were easier to carry, but they were also heavier with fear. Their eyes fluttered open as he moved them, and they whispered in Apache, voices trembling. Elias spoke calming words even though they might not understand. Once all 7 girls were on the horse, 2 sitting, the rest held safely, he guided riders slowly back toward his ranch. He walked beside the horse the whole way, steadying the girls whenever they swayed. The sun was rising by then, and the heat was already beginning its climb. Back at the ranch, Elias carried them inside his small house, laying them on blankets near the warm fireplace. He brought more water, soft bread, and dried fruit, placing the food within reach for when they woke. Then he sat beside them and waited. He didn't know what story they carried, but he knew it was important, dangerous, even. He'd lived long enough near Apache lands to understand that children didn't wander far from their families without reason. Something serious had happened. One by one, the girls began to wake. Their eyes opened slowly, scanning the room with confusion. When they saw Elias, they flinched at first, unsure if he was friend or foe. He stayed still, keeping his hands visible, showing no threat. He spoke softly. "You're safe here. This is my home. I found you and brought you away from danger." They watched him quietly. The oldest girl, around 14 maybe, scooted slightly closer to shield the younger ones, as if protecting them. Elias respected that instinct. It showed courage. He used the few Apache words he knew: water, safe, help, to reassure them. After a few minutes, the older girl weakly nodded and accepted the water he offered. Hours passed. The girls rested, ate slowly, and stayed close to each other, seeking comfort from familiar faces. Elias let them be. He cooked stew, hoping the warm smell would make them feel at ease. He kept the windows open so they could feel the breeze, something gentle and familiar after whatever fear they had faced. As the day turned to evening, the girls began whispering among themselves in Apache, their voices low and shaken. Elias didn't push them to explain. He knew they needed to feel safe first. But their eyes told him enough: they had seen something they shouldn't have seen. Something that frightened them more than the desert, or strangers, or hunger. Late in the evening, when the sun dipped down and painted the sky orange, the oldest girl finally looked at Elias and pointed weakly toward the east, the direction the wagon tracks had gone. Then she drew a small shape on the dusty floor with her finger. It looked like 2 crossed lines, an unfamiliar symbol to him at that moment. Elias watched carefully. She drew it again, slower this time, making sure he noticed. A double cross mark. Elias felt his stomach tighten. He had seen that mark before on papers and crates carried by a land speculator group known for pushing people off land they wanted. They were not simple thieves. They were clever, patient, willing to pretend to be anyone if it served their goal. The symbol on the floor changed everything. Elias understood that this wasn't a random crime or desert mischief. It was a plan, a dangerous one, that used innocent children as pieces. He sat there quietly, letting the truth settle heavily inside him. Someone was trying to frame the Apache. Someone wanted to cause fear between settlers and the tribe. Someone wanted chaos. And Elias had found their evidence. As night settled, Elias looked at the 7 girls sleeping beside each other like a small flock seeking warmth. He knew that whatever was coming, he could not stay quiet. He would protect them, and he would uncover the truth behind the staged scene. The desert was full of secrets, but he had just stumbled onto one that could change everything. The sun had barely risen when Elias stepped outside the next morning. The sky was soft and pale, with hints of yellow stretching across the horizon. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that made every small sound feel louder. He listened to the wind brush against the wooden porch and hoped the girls inside were finally resting peacefully. After the long night, they needed it. He poured water into a small basin and washed the dust from his face. Then, he checked the barn, fed his horse, and made sure the ranch was secure. He didn't know who might come searching for the girls, or if anyone had already noticed they were gone from wherever they had been taken. The idea kept turning in his mind, creating a feeling he couldn't ignore. When he walked back inside the house, he found the 7 girls awake, sitting close to each other on the blankets he laid out. Their eyes were still tired, but they were calmer than yesterday. They followed Elias with their eyes, trying to understand who he was and what he wanted. Elias smiled lightly, hoping to ease their fear. "You're all safe," he said gently. "No one here will harm you." The girls didn't speak at first, but their shoulders relaxed a little. The oldest girl nodded slowly, though her eyes still held questions. Elias warmed leftover stew from last night and served it in wooden bowls. The smell filled the room with comfort. The younger girls accepted their bowls shyly. A couple of them whispered to each other in soft voices. He let them whisper. They deserved time to feel safe. After they ate, Elias sat on a low stool near them. He knew it was time to understand what really happened, but he needed to communicate gently. He didn't speak their language well, but he knew enough words and gestures to guide a simple conversation. He pointed east, toward the direction of the wagon tracks he had seen the day before. Then, he drew a small symbol on the dusty floor. The double cross mark the oldest girl had shown him. He looked up at her, waiting. The oldest girl blinked and nodded, confirming he understood correctly. She pressed a hand to her chest, then pointed to each of the other girls. Their names spoken softly: Nayeli, Sani, Tala, Kosa, Luyu, Winona, and the youngest, a tiny girl with bright eyes named Chenoa. Elias repeated their names with care. The girls relaxed a little more. Hearing their names spoken kindly seemed to make them feel seen, not lost. Slowly, using gestures and simple Apache words, the oldest girl, Nayeli, began explaining what happened. She raised her hand and shaped her fingers like the horns of a deer, then pointed toward the east. Elias recognized the symbol. She meant strangers, outsiders, people who didn't belong to the land. She made a gesture of someone wearing a covering over their face, then motioned in a sweeping way that meant pretending or copying. Elias understood. Someone had disguised themselves as Apache. Someone had used clothing and symbols that didn't match real tribal traditions. Nayeli then pointed to the younger girls, placing her hand gently on Chenoa's shoulder, comforting her. The little one looked down, as if remembering something she wished she could forget. Nayeli continued explaining in quiet words and motions. She showed how they were taken from different places, some from gathering berries, others from carrying water, and some while helping their families. They hadn't known each other before that day. The strangers gathered them together and took them across the land. Nayeli mimicked the bounce of a wagon ride, swaying side to side. Elias nodded. He remembered the tracks he saw. Then Nayeli made a sweeping motion that looked like drawing a line across the air and pointed back to the clearing Elias found them in. She traced the double-cross symbol again with her finger, pressing her fingertip firmly into the dust as if the symbol itself brought fear. Elias listened carefully. Each movement, each sound mattered. Though he didn't understand every word, the meaning became clear. A group of outsiders had posed as Apache to create a lie. A lie big enough to push settlers against the tribe. A lie that could start conflict. The younger girls began talking too, adding small pieces to the story. Tiny details, but important ones. They mentioned wagons, loud voices, clothes with patches that didn't look right, and men who whispered about making sure the soldiers believe it. They had heard enough to know the plan was dangerous. Elias felt a deep ache in his chest. These children had been caught in a scheme far bigger than themselves, and the people behind it weren't just thieves or drifters. They were organized. They were trying to shape a false story that would harm an entire community. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. He couldn't let this plot continue. Not when innocent lives were involved, both Apache and settler alike. He pointed to himself, then to them, and said, "I will help you. You're safe here." He placed his palm over his heart to show his sincerity. Nayeli watched him closely. Then, after a long moment, she mirrored the gesture, placing her own small hand over her heart. The other girls did the same. It wasn't a full trust yet, but it was hope, and that was enough. Elias knew he needed more answers, but the girls needed rest. He gave them soft blankets and let them sit by the fire while he stepped outside to think. The land stretched far and empty around him, but he felt the weight of unseen eyes. If the gang who took these children realized they had escaped, they might return. He needed to act before danger arrived at his door. His mind turned to Chief Nantan, an older Apache leader he had met years back. Nantan was a wise man who kept peace more often than conflict. Elias knew that if he brought the girls to Nantan, the leader could protect them and help uncover the truth behind the plot. But Nantan's camp was not close. It was deep in the canyon area, a journey that required guidance, and Elias couldn't risk moving the girls until they were stronger. Later in the afternoon, while the girls played quietly in the yard, picking small stones and arranging them into circles, Elias prepared supplies, water skins, dried food, extra blankets. He didn't know when the journey would begin, but he wanted to be ready. As evening approached, Nayeli walked outside to him. She pointed toward the setting sun, then touched her chest and tapped the ground gently. She spoke softly. Home. Far. Elias understood. She wanted to return to her family, but she knew it wasn't safe yet. He nodded. "You'll go home," he said with a firm but kind voice. "I promise you." Her eyes lit with relief, the first sign of peace he had seen on her face since rescuing them. The younger girls followed her outside. They sat on the porch steps, watching the sky turn golden. For a moment, the ranch felt like a normal home filled with children's soft chatter. Elias watched them and felt a warmth he hadn't felt in years. Something inside him shifted. He realized how deeply he wanted them to be safe. But that peaceful moment didn't last. A flicker of motion caught Elias's attention near the far edge of his property. A small dot of dust rose in the distance. Maybe an animal. Or maybe not. Elias narrowed his eyes. The dust cloud was moving too evenly, too straight. Someone was riding or traveling toward his land. Elias calmly told the girls to go back inside. He didn't want to scare them, so he kept his voice gentle. They obeyed quickly, trusting his tone. Once they were inside, Elias grabbed his binoculars and stepped behind the barn's side wall for cover. The dust cloud grew clearer. A wagon. And not just one rider, several shapes moved around it, too far to recognize but close enough to know the truth. Someone was coming. Someone who traveled in a wagon. Someone who might be looking for the girls. Elias's heart beat slower, not faster. Years of ranch life had taught him that fear never helped, but calm thinking did. He walked back inside and closed the door, quietly. The girls looked at him with worried eyes, sensing something had changed. He forced a small smile. "You all stay inside," he whispered. "Keep quiet. Everything will be fine." He stood by the window, watching the distant wagon crawl closer along the horizon. Maybe they were harmless travelers. Maybe not. But Elias no longer believed in coincidence, not after the staged scene he found. As the wagon approached, he realized two things clearly. First, he could no longer delay taking the girls to Chief Nantan. Second, the people behind the plot were moving fast. And now, danger might already be coming straight toward his quiet ranch. Elias stood beside the window for a long moment, watching the wagon move slowly across the open land. The girls stayed behind him near the fireplace, sitting close together like a small flock that sensed a storm approaching. Their eyes were wide, following every movement he made. They didn't understand exactly what was happening, but they felt the tension in the room. He turned toward them and spoke in a gentle voice, the calmest voice he could manage. "Everything will be all right. You just stay quiet. Stay together." Nayeli nodded, pulling little Chinoa closer and wrapping an arm protectively around her. The other girls drew closer to each other, whispering softly in their language. Their voices trembled, but the warmth of the room and the presence of someone they trusted kept them steady. Elias walked to the back door and stepped outside quietly. He closed the door behind him, careful not to let it make a sound. The wagon had come closer now, close enough for him to see 3 riders around it. 1 wagon, 3 horses, too many for casual travelers, but too few for a military group. The men guiding the wagon didn't wear uniforms, and their hats were pulled low to block the sun. He whispered to himself, "Not settlers. Not soldiers. Then who?" The answer felt too obvious. These were the men who had taken the girls. Elias didn't want a confrontation. His ranch was a place of peace, and he had 7 frightened children sheltering inside. He needed to see what these men wanted, without letting them know what or who he was protecting. He led Ryder into the barn and closed the door, making sure the men wouldn't see the horse. Then he walked around the barn's side, staying partly hidden as the wagon rolled up to the front of his property. One of the riders, a tall man with a coat that looked too clean for frontier life, pulled his horse forward. He lifted a hand as if greeting a neighbor and called out, "Hello there. Anyone home?" Elias didn't answer. He stayed hidden, waiting. The tall man tried again. "We're just passing through. Had some trouble near the canyon. Thought maybe someone around here had seen anything unusual." The tone of his voice was too smooth, too practiced. Elias knew men like him, men who said friendly words with unfriendly intent. The second rider circled the wagon slowly, scanning the area. Elias ducked lower behind the barn, watching the man's eyes trace the house, the porch, the windows. The third rider stayed behind the wagon. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He just watched. After a moment, the first man continued speaking. "We heard there might have been young ones wandering out here. We're looking for them, trying to make sure they return home safely. One day 4. Elias felt anger tighten inside him, but he kept his expression steady. These were the same men who staged that strange scene. The same men who wanted to blame the Apache for something they didn't do. Their voices made the air feel colder, even under the heat of the sun. Elias stepped out slowly from behind the barn, walking toward them with steady steps. He kept his hands visible. "Morning," he called out, his voice calm. The tall man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We're tracking some lost children," he repeated. "We're worried they got themselves hurt." Were. Elias gave a slow nod. "Children? Around this area? Haven't seen any." It wasn't a lie, not the way he said it. He had found them far from this spot. Still, he didn't like saying it. But he knew telling the truth would put the girls in danger. The second rider leaned forward in his saddle. "You sure about that? 7 of them? All Apache?" Elias kept his voice even. "I'm sure. If there were 7 children running around, I'd know." The man stared at him a second longer, studying his face for any sign of hesitation. Elias gave him nothing. The riders whispered among themselves, their words too quiet to understand. After a moment, the first man tipped his hat. "Well, then, appreciate your time. If you see anything unusual, let us know." They rode off slowly, but Elias didn't lower his guard. Not until the wagon and riders disappeared over a distant hill. And even then, he knew this wasn't the end. Those men would keep searching. They would return if they suspected anything. Time was running short. Elias went back inside the house. The girls rushed toward him immediately, their faces filled with worry. Nayeli touched his arm gently, asking with her eyes if danger had passed. "They're gone," Elias said softly. "For now." He saw relief wash over their small faces. But he also saw how tired they were of being afraid. They deserved peace, and he needed to give it to them. "We leave tonight," Elias said quietly. "All of us. We're going to meet Chief Nantan." The decision felt heavy but necessary. Staying at the ranch would only bring the gang straight to his doorstep again. Nantan lived deep in the canyon, hidden, protected, and surrounded by people who would welcome the girls with open arms. The girls listened carefully. Nayeli nodded, understanding the plan. She didn't smile, but she didn't look scared either. She trusted Elias now, more than she had that first night. The rest of the day passed quickly. Elias packed supplies into 2 saddlebags, food, water skins, blankets, and a small amount of medicine. He prepared Ryder and his second horse, Luna, for the journey. The girls helped in small ways, gathering firewood for the last time, or folding blankets neatly. Even the youngest tried to help, carrying light bundles with tiny hands. As the sun began to set, painting the land in deep orange and purple, Elias gathered the girls in front of the barn. "We ride close," he told them gently. "Stay near me. We'll take the quiet path. No one will see us." Nayeli translated the message with simple gestures and soft words. Elias lifted the youngest girls onto the horses, first 2 on Ryder and 2 on Luna. The older ones walked beside him, holding onto the horses' reins. Elias walked at the front, leading the way through the empty fields. The evening air was cool and filled with the smell of desert plants. The stars began to appear as they left the ranch behind. Elias didn't look back, but he felt a pang in his heart. He didn't know when he would return. Maybe not until this danger was settled. The moon rose slowly, casting silver light across the land. The group moved quietly, avoiding open areas and staying near the low hills and dry creek beds. Elias kept checking behind them, making sure no one followed. Hours passed. The girls were tired but brave. Not once did they complain. They trusted Elias to guide them safely. Just before midnight, they reached the canyon's entrance, a narrow path between tall red stone walls. The wind here sounded different, almost like a low whisper guiding them forward. Elias felt safer already. The canyon grew deeper, and soon they reached a small hidden clearing where old campfires once burned. Elias stopped, knowing they were close to Nantan's territory. He signaled with a calm gesture, an old greeting he had learned long ago. For a moment, there was silence. Then, softly, shadows moved near the cliff walls. Several Apache scouts stepped out, quiet as the night itself. They didn't draw weapons. They recognized Elias immediately. One scout stepped forward. "Rancher," he said with a respectful nod. "Chief Nantan has been waiting for you." Elias breathed out, relieved. "I need to speak with him, and the girls need shelter." The scout's eyes widened when he saw the 7 children. He bowed his head slightly. "We will take them. They are safe now." The girls stepped closer to Elias, their eyes filled with both fear and hope. Nayeli took Elias's hand and squeezed lightly, thanking him without words. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You're home now," he whispered. The scouts guided the girls deeper into the canyon toward safety. Elias followed behind, ready to share everything he had seen. The tracks, the symbol, the staged scene, the wagon that came searching. But as they walked deeper into the quiet canyon, Elias understood something clearly. The truth he carried was bigger than he imagined, and revealing it would change everything for the Apache, the settlers, and for himself. Elias followed the Apache scouts deeper into the canyon. The moonlight touched the tall rock walls and made them glow faintly, as if guiding the group forward. Ryder and Luna walked quietly behind him, carrying the young girls who were now half asleep, exhausted from fear and the long journey. The older ones walked close to the scouts, still gripping each other's hands. Soon, the narrow path opened into a wide, hidden valley between the canyon walls. Torches flickered softly near small lodges, and warm orange light spilled out like a promise of safety. People stepped out quietly when they heard the scouts' arrival. They recognized the children at once and gasped softly, not in fear, but in relief that they were alive. The moment the girls entered the valley, mothers rushed forward. A woman took Tala into her arms, crying softly as she held her daughter close. Another woman lifted little Chenoa, hugging her tightly and whispering soothing words. The girls didn't cry loudly, they simply melted into the warm embrace of home, as if the weight of the last days finally slipped off their shoulders. Nayeli stood at the center, looking around until she saw a tall man with gray hair and gentle eyes approaching. When their eyes met, she whispered, "Father," and ran into his arms. He lifted her with trembling hands, pressing his forehead against hers. Elias watched quietly, letting the emotional reunions unfold without stepping forward. Family was being restored. Fear was being washed away. This was the moment the girls deserved. The scouts led Elias to the far end of the valley, where Chief Nantan stood waiting beside a small fire. The chief wore a calm expression, but his eyes held both wisdom and worry. He nodded respectfully as Elias approached. "You came far at night," Nantan said softly. "Your steps carried danger and hope together." Elias bowed his head. "I had to bring them. The girls were in trouble, and more trouble may come." The chief motioned for him to sit by the fire. Elias lowered himself onto a woven blanket laid on the ground, and Nantan sat beside him. The crackling of the fire filled the silence for a moment, warm and comforting in the cool canyon air. "Tell me everything," Nantan said. Elias explained it all, how he found the girls tied near the tree, how the scene looked staged, the wagon tracks, the men who came searching for them, and the strange double-cross symbol. He told him about the disguises, the girls' fear, and the whispers they had heard from the outsiders. Nantan listened carefully without interrupting once. His face tightened at times, but he stayed peaceful, letting Elias speak until the last detail was shared. Finally, the chief looked deeply into the fire and said, "I feared something like this. For weeks, we have heard rumors. Settlers whisper that my people are to blame for trouble near the mines. Soldiers grow uneasy. A spark can start a fire, and someone is trying to drop that spark between us." He turned his gaze back to Elias. "These men want our people to be removed from our land. They want the army to think we are dangerous." His voice was calm, but sorrow rested beneath it. Elias nodded slowly. "They use those girls to make their lie look true. They want to start trouble." Nantan drew a long breath. "Then we must stop the trouble before it begins." The chief called 2 scouts and sent them to watch the paths leading to the canyon. He knew the men searching for the girls would not stop easily. But here, surrounded by high walls and hidden paths, the children were finally safe. When dawn touched the sky, Chief Nantan asked Elias to walk with him toward a high ridge overlooking the valley. From there, Elias could see the camp below the families, the small lodges, smoke rising from morning fires. The sight felt peaceful and strong. "These children," Nantan began, "carry the truth of what happened, but they are young. They need time to rest before speaking of their fear." He paused, then placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. "You, however, are ready. You must take the evidence to the soldiers before the gang acts again." Elias had expected this. He knew he would have to speak to the army. He was not a man of speeches, but he understood the weight of responsibility. "I'll go," he said simply. Nantan nodded. "You will not go alone. My scouts will guide you, and if you meet danger, they will protect the message you carry." The plan was set quickly. Elias would leave by midday with 2 trusted scouts. He would take the rope pieces, the fabric scraps, and the stories Nayeli and the others had told through gestures and quiet words. With these, he hoped to show the soldiers that the Apache were not at fault. Before leaving, Elias visited the children once more. They sat together near their families, eating warm morning food. When they saw him, they smiled shyly and stood up. Nayeli approached first and handed him a small, carved charm made from smooth wood, a symbol of thanks from her people. Elias accepted it with gentle hands. "You'll be all right now," he told them softly. "Stay close to your families." Chenoa reached out and grabbed Elias's hand, giving it a light squeeze with her tiny fingers. Her eyes, full of gratitude and trust, said more than words ever could. Elias squeezed her hand back before standing. By the time the sun climbed high, Elias mounted Ryder while the 2 scouts took their own horses. Together, the 3 men began the long journey toward the army outpost near the river. The canyon protected them until they reached the open plains, where the wind was stronger and the sun brighter. Elias kept checking behind them, expecting the gang's wagon to reappear at any moment. But the plains remained empty. The sound of their horses was the only noise in the wide desert. By late afternoon, they reached the outpost. Soldiers noticed them approaching, but saw no weapons drawn, so they didn't raise alarm. The commanding officer, Captain Reeves, stepped out of his office when he recognized Elias. "Ward," he called. "Didn't expect to see you out here. Something wrong?" Elias dismounted and nodded. "Something is very wrong, Captain, and I need to talk to you in private." Reeves frowned but motioned him inside. The scouts stayed outside respectfully, standing near their horses. Inside, Elias laid all the evidence on the captain's desk: rope, fibers, cloth fragments, the strange symbol, and the story as he had learned it from the girls. At first, Reeves looked doubtful. But as Elias continued speaking, and as the scouts shared what their people had seen in recent days, the captain's doubt faded. When he lifted the cloth with the double-cross symbol, he cursed softly under his breath. "I know this mark," Reeves said quietly. "They've caused trouble in other towns, always stirring fear, always pretending to be someone they're not." He looked up at Elias. "You may have stopped something much bigger than you realize." Reeves wasted no time. He ordered a detachment of soldiers to ride out with the scouts and catch the gang before they disappeared. The scouts guided them quickly. With evidence, witnesses, and a clear path, the gang had no way to hide. By the next sunrise, word came back. The gang had been found near the hills, trying to set up another scene. They were taken into custody without anyone being harmed. The threat was gone. The plot was exposed. Peace had been protected. When Elias returned to the canyon a few days later to share the good news, the entire valley welcomed him warmly. The girls ran to him, shy but smiling, no longer trapped in fear. Families thanked him with kind words, soft laughter, and gentle smiles. Nayeli stood beside him and said in her quiet voice, "You saved us. You saved many." Elias shook his head. "I just did what anyone should do." But Nantan placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Not everyone does what they should, but you did." The rancher stayed for a full day in the canyon, sharing food, speaking with families, and watching the children play freely without fear. When it was time for him to return to his own land, the girls gathered near the path to wave goodbye. Chenoa lifted the small wooden charm she had given him earlier and pointed to her heart. Elias touched the charm in his pocket and nodded softly. Then he rode home. When he reached his ranch, everything was as he left it: quiet, peaceful, touched only by the wind. The land felt different now. Not because it had changed, but because he had. He had carried 7 children through fear to safety. And in doing so, he had carried truth through danger and protected a fragile peace. Elias stepped onto his porch, breathed in the evening air, and whispered to himself, This land, it's worth protecting. And though he returned to a life of silence and open skies, he knew he was not alone. Somewhere beyond the canyon walls, 7 families remembered him. 7 young girls slept safely under the stars. And Chief Nantan's people carried a story of a lone rancher who stepped forward when no one else would. The desert, wide and quiet, held the memory of that courage for years to come.